You have spent your whole life believing things about history that were written in a Hollywood writer's room, not a library. Knights, pirates, samurai, gladiators. The version you know is the version someone made up because the truth was not dramatic enough. These are 33 historical facts that are pure fiction, and by the end of this video, you will trust movies a lot less. 1. Picture a cowboy. You are imagining a wide-brimmed Stetson hat, right? Of course you are, because every Western movie ever made told you that is what cowboys wore. But here is the truth that would shatter John Wayne's heart. The most popular hat on the actual Wild West frontier was the bowler hat. Yes, that round, polite-looking British hat you associate with London bankers and Charlie Chaplin. Butch Cassidy wore one. Billy the Kid wore one. Bat Masterson wore one. The Stetson, boss of the plains hat, did exist in the 1860s, but it was expensive and not nearly as widespread as movies suggest. Most working cowboys grabbed whatever cheap hat kept the sun off, and bowler hats were durable, affordable, and stayed on your head in the wind. So the next time you picture a rugged outlaw riding into a dusty town, put a little round hat on him. That is historically accurate. 2. The Iron Maiden is probably the most iconic torture device in history. A human-shaped metal coffin lined with sharp spikes on the inside, slamming shut on the screaming victim. Terrifying, right? It is also completely fake. There is zero evidence that any Iron Maiden existed during the Middle Ages. The first ones were literally built in the 1800s, cobbled together from old artifacts and some creative metalwork, specifically to be displayed in museums and freak shows for paying tourists who wanted to believe medieval people were savages. The whole concept was basically a 19th century theme park attraction. Real medieval torture was horrifying enough on its own, with devices like the rack and thumbscrews. But apparently that was not dramatic enough for Victorian showmen, so they invented a giant spiked coffin and slapped a medieval label on it. And Hollywood has been running with that lie ever since. 3. Every movie about ancient Egypt shows the same scene. Thousands of miserable slaves dragging massive stone blocks under the blazing sun, getting whipped by cruel overseers. It is one of the most powerful images in cinema history, and it is almost certainly wrong. Archaeologists have found the workers' village near the Giza pyramids, and what they discovered flipped the script entirely. These were skilled, organized laborers, not slaves. They slept in purpose-built dormitories. They ate prime beef. They received medical care for broken bones. And they were paid, partly in bread and partly in beer, roughly 4 to 5 liters of beer per day. They even had pride in their work. Graffiti found near the pharaoh Khufu's burial chamber reads, "The Friends of Khufu Gang." That is a work crew name. Slaves do not name their work crews like a bowling team. The whole "slaves built the pyramid" story has been fueled by Hollywood dramatizations for decades, but the evidence tells a very different story. 4. Close your eyes and picture a ninja. You see a figure head to toe in a skin-tight black suit, right? A shadow warrior slicing through the darkness in what is essentially a black leotard. Here's the problem. If you are trying to be the most covert operative in feudal Japan, wearing an all-black outfit at night actually makes you stand out against the moonlit sky. Real ninja, or shinobi, dressed as ordinary people. Farmers, monks, merchants, traveling performers. Their greatest weapon was not a throwing star. It was looking so painfully boring that nobody gave them a second glance. The black suit myth actually comes from Japanese kabuki theater, where stagehands wore all black to signal to the audience that they were invisible. When playwrights wanted to show a ninja sneaking up on someone, they dressed the actor like a stagehand. The audience loved the trick, and eventually everyone forgot it was a theater convention, not a historical fact. 5. One of the most memorable scenes in Jurassic Park is when the characters freeze in front of the Tyrannosaurus, because its vision is based on movement. If you stand perfectly still, you are invisible to it. It is a brilliant movie moment. It is also completely made up. Paleontologists have studied T-Rex skull structures extensively, and the verdict is devastating for anyone who thought standing still would save them. T-Rex had forward-facing eyes that gave it a binocular vision range of about 55 degrees. which is actually wider than a modern hawk's. Hawks, by the way, can spot a mouse from a mile away. T-Rex did not just see you standing still. It saw you standing still, sweating, and quietly regretting every life decision that led to this moment. Steven Spielberg needed a tense scene, so he invented a weakness for the most fearsome predator that ever walked the earth. Great cinema. Terrible survival advice. 6. Every medieval movie has the same vibe. Filthy peasants covered in mud, people throwing chamber pots out of windows, and not a bar of soap in sight. Hollywood absolutely loves the idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was a walking biohazard. But medieval people actually enjoyed bathing quite a bit. Public bathhouses were popular across Europe and functioned almost like modern spas, with large wooden tubs, steam rooms, food, and even entertainment. People washed their hands and faces before and after meals because, believe it or not, they understood that dirt could make you sick. They used soap. They combed their hair. Some towns had multiple bathhouses operating like social clubs. The myth that medieval Europeans were permanently filthy actually comes from a much later period, when some early modern doctors started warning that hot water opened your pores to disease. So the era we think of as dirty was actually cleaner than the centuries that followed it. Hollywood just grabbed the stereotype and never let go. 7. Pirate movies love this scene. A trembling prisoner walks along a wooden plank extending over the ocean while a cackling pirate captain watches. Dramatic, cinematic, and almost entirely fictional. The whole walk the plank concept comes mostly from 19th century adventure novels and was popularized by writers like Robert Louis Stevenson and J.M. Barrie. There is barely any historical evidence that real pirates use this method at all. When actual pirates wanted to deal with someone, they were far less theatrical and far more brutal. The most common methods included simply throwing people overboard, marooning them on deserted islands, or the truly nightmarish practice of keel hauling, which involved dragging a person under the ship's hull through barnacle-encrusted wood. That last one was so gruesome that the victim rarely survived, and if they did, they wish they had not. But none of that looks as cool on a movie poster as a guy nervously shuffling along a plank. 8. In the movies, every gladiator fight ends the same way. One warrior standing over his defeated opponent, the roaring crowd screaming for blood, and the emperor giving the famous thumbs down to signal death. Almost none of that is accurate. Gladiators were professional athletes, more like ancient MMA fighters than disposable death row inmates. Training a gladiator was insanely expensive, and their owners had zero interest in watching their investment bleed out on the arena floor after one bad fight. Most bouts were fought in rounds with rules and referees, and the vast majority did not end in death. Roughly 90% of gladiators fought multiple times throughout their careers. And that iconic thumbs-down gesture, historians are not even sure which direction the thumb pointed or what it meant. The thumbs down equals death idea was largely popularized by a 19th century painting and then cemented by Hollywood. Gladiators were celebrities, sponsored athletes with fan followings. Killing them off every Tuesday would have been terrible business. 9. In classic Western films, every town is a lawless shooting gallery. Gunslingers square off at high noon, bullets fly through saloon doors, and bodies pile up on Main Street. The real Wild West was a lot more boring than that. Many frontier towns had strict gun control laws. Dodge City, Tombstone, and Wichita all required visitors to surrender their firearms upon entering town limits. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Earps were trying to enforce a local weapons ordinance. Homicide rates in some cattle towns were surprisingly low in most years, and a single murder could drastically skew the statistics for a tiny community. The average cowboy spent his days doing backbreaking ranch work, not dueling in the street. But a movie about a tired man herding cattle for 12 hours and then falling asleep in his bowler hat does not exactly sell tickets. So Hollywood invented a version of the West that never really existed. 10. Mel Gibson's Braveheart is one of the most beloved historical epics ever made. It is also one of the most historically inaccurate films in cinema history, and that is a competitive category. William Wallace charges into battle wearing a kilt in his clan tartan with blue woad paint smeared across his face. The problem? Kilts as we know them did not appear in Scotland until roughly the 16th century, about 300 years after Wallace's death in 1305. In Wallace's time, Scottish men wore tunics and cloaks, similar to what most Northern Europeans wore. And that blue face paint? That tradition is associated with the ancient Picts, who lived over 1,000 years before Wallace was born. The film also shows Wallace having a romantic affair with Princess Isabella of France, who in reality was approximately 3 years old at the time of the events depicted. Braveheart is a fantastic movie if you treat it as pure fantasy. As a history lesson, it is roughly as reliable as a fortune cookie. 11. The Salem witch trials are one of America's most infamous chapters, and the image everyone has is clear. Screaming women tied to stakes, flames rising, the whole medieval bonfire treatment. Except no one was burned at the stake in Salem. Not a single person. Witch burning was more of a European practice. In Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, the convicted were hanged. 19 people died on the gallows. And then there was Giles Corey, an 80-year-old man who refused to enter a plea at trial. The court's response was a procedure called pressing, where increasingly heavy stones were placed on his chest over the course of 2 days to force him to speak. According to the accounts, his only words during the entire ordeal were, "More weight." Corey remains the only person in American history to be executed by pressing. No fires, no stakes. The real story is actually more disturbing than the Hollywood version, which is saying something. 12. Cleopatra is the ultimate Egyptian icon. The exotic queen of the Nile, draped in gold, ruling from her throne on the banks of the ancient kingdom. And she was not Egyptian. At all. Cleopatra VII belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was founded by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's Macedonian Greek generals. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years and deliberately kept their bloodline Greek by marrying within their own family. And yes, that means exactly what you think it means. Cleopatra was ethnically Macedonian Greek through and through. What made her exceptional, though, was that she was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually bother learning the Egyptian language. Her predecessors governed Egypt for centuries without speaking a word of Egyptian. She also embraced Egyptian culture and religion in ways her family never had. So the most Egyptian thing about Cleopatra was not her blood, it was her effort. Hollywood keeps casting her as the quintessential Egyptian ruler, but her family tree leads straight back to Greece. 13. Every medieval movie shows the same castle interior. Cold, gray, bare stone walls, dim torchlight, and an atmosphere that screams, "Nobody has been happy here since the building was constructed." That is what centuries of decay look like, not what medieval castles actually looked like when people lived in them. In reality, castle interiors were vibrant, colorful, and sometimes downright flashy. Walls were plastered smooth and painted with bright reds, blues, greens, and golds, often featuring geometric patterns, floral designs, or elaborate scenes. Wealthy lords hung massive tapestries, which served double duty as decoration and insulation against the brutal drafts that came through stone walls. Floors were covered with rushes or woven mats, and furniture, while heavy, was often carved and painted. A medieval great hall in its prime looked more like an art gallery than a dungeon. We see bare stone today because paint fades, plaster crumbles, and tapestries rot over 800 years. Hollywood saw the ruins and assumed that was the original look. 14. Samurai in movies are always the same. Noble, stoic warriors who live and die by their sacred code of honor, choosing death over dishonor every single time. The reality is a bit messier. The Bushido Code, this elegant rulebook for the honorable warrior, was largely romanticized and codified centuries after the samurai's golden age. The actual Sengoku period, which lasted from 1467 to 1603, was an era of near-constant scheming, backstabbing, and betrayal between samurai clans. Lords switched sides when it was profitable. Warriors ambushed enemies without warning. And that myth about samurai hating firearms? completely false. Japanese samurai embraced guns with enthusiasm after the Portuguese introduced them in the 1540s, and at one point Japan had more firearms per capita than most European nations. The noble, sword-only warrior refusing to use a gun because it lacked honor? That is a character from a movie, not from history. Real samurai wanted to win, and they used whatever worked. 15. The term caveman is one of the most misleading words in the English language because it suggests that prehistoric humans lived primarily in caves. They did not. Caves were used for specific purposes, like creating those stunning wall paintings in places like Lascaux in France, performing rituals, or sheltering from extreme weather. But for everyday living, most prehistoric people built their own structures. By the Upper Paleolithic period, humans were constructing temporary shelters and tents made from animal hides stretched over wooden frames or mammoth bones. These were portable, practical, and could be set up wherever food was available. Living deep inside a cave full-time would have been cold, damp, dark, and a terrible idea for a species that needed sunlight and ventilation. The reason we associate them with caves is simple. Tents and huts decompose. Paintings on cave walls survive for 40,000 years. So the evidence that lasted the longest created the most misleading impression. We should really be calling them tent people, but that does not have quite the same ring to it. 16. Every sword seen in every movie comes with that satisfying metallic ring when the blade slides out of its sheath. That sharp, dramatic swing sound. It is so iconic that most people assume it is just what swords sound like. It is not. Medieval scabbards were made from wood lined with sheepskin or oiled leather, materials chosen specifically to protect the blade from moisture and rust. Pulling a steel blade out of a wooden and leather sheath produces almost no sound at all, maybe a soft whisper of leather. If scabbards were made of metal, the blade would scrape against it every single time you drew or sheathed it, grinding the edge and dulling your weapon with every use. No swordsman would tolerate that for a second. That ringing metallic sound was invented by Hollywood sound designers because a realistic, near-silent sword draw is cinematically boring. They needed drama, so they added the audio equivalent of a fireworks show. Now an entire generation thinks swords are the noisiest objects in history. 17. When someone says chivalry, most people picture a knight in shining armor placing his cloak over a puddle for a lady, writing love poems by candlelight, and generally being the medieval version of a romantic comedy lead. That is almost entirely a fantasy cooked up by later writers and then turbocharged by Hollywood. The actual chivalric code was a practical military framework. It dealt with things like how to conduct yourself on the battlefield, when to show mercy to a defeated opponent, how to treat prisoners of war, and how to behave in the service of your lord. Romance and courtly love were added to the concept later by French poets and troubadours in the 12th century, who basically invented a literary genre and slapped chivalry on it. Real knights were professional soldiers first. Some were brutal, many were illiterate, and their primary concern was winning battles and managing their estates. The idea that they spent their evenings composing sonnets for ladies is roughly as accurate as saying modern soldiers spend their downtime writing haiku. 18. James Cameron's Titanic has one of its most emotionally devastating scenes when third-class passengers are shown being deliberately locked behind iron gates while the ship sinks, trapped below deck as the wealthy climb into lifeboats above. It is heartbreaking cinema. It is also misleading. Those gates and barriers on the Titanic were real, but they existed because of United States immigration regulations, not because of some sinister class-based murder plot. The law required physical separation between passenger classes to prevent the spread of disease during transatlantic crossings. During the sinking, some gates were opened late or not at all, but this was due to chaos, confusion, and a crew that had no coherent evacuation plan for steerage passengers. Many third-class passengers also did not speak English, so they could not understand the crew's instructions and had no idea where to go. The tragedy was real, and the death toll among third-class passengers was disproportionately high. But the cause was systemic negligence and panic, not a deliberate decision to sacrifice the poor. 19. The movie 300 gave us one of its most memorable scenes when a Spartan elder inspects a newborn baby, finds it unworthy, and casts it into a deep pit below Mount Tegadus. The image is seared into pop culture. Sparta was brutal, no question. They had a harsh military culture that valued physical perfection. But when archaeologists actually investigated the pit at the base of that cliff, they found something unexpected. The bones recovered were overwhelmingly from adult males aged 18 to 35, not infants. Not a single baby skeleton was discovered. The few female remains found did not match infant profiles either. The story of systematic baby throwing appears to trace back to Plutarch, a Greek historian writing centuries after Sparta's peak, who had a well-known tendency to dramatize. Modern researchers believe the pit was used for executing criminals and prisoners of war, not newborns. The ancient myth was dramatic enough for Hollywood to run with it uncritically, and now millions of people believe Sparta operated a baby disposal chute. 20. Pirates of the Caribbean, Treasure Island, and basically every pirate story ever told revolves around the same idea. A tattered treasure map, an X marking the spot, and chests of gold coins buried on some tropical island. In reality, there is exactly one confirmed historical case of a pirate actually burying treasure, and that was Captain William Kidd in 1699, who stashed some loot on Gardiner's Island off New York before his arrest. One guy. One time. That is the entire historical basis for the most persistent pirate trope in fiction. Real pirates had zero interest in saving for retirement. They operated on a spend it today because you might be dead tomorrow philosophy, blowing their plunder on rum, gambling, and port town entertainment almost as fast as they stole it. Burying gold on a deserted island and drawing a map would have been laughably impractical for men who could not predict where they would be next week. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island in 1883, and the buried treasure myth exploded from there. One novel rewrote the entire public perception of piracy. 21. Joan of Arc in movies is essentially a medieval action hero. She charges into battle on horseback, sword raised, cutting down English soldiers left and right like a one-woman army. The real Joan of Arc was extraordinary, but not for the reasons Hollywood suggests. At her trial, Joan herself testified that she carried her banner into battle rather than a weapon, specifically because she did not want to kill anyone. Her exact words, as recorded in the trial transcripts, were, "I have never killed a man." Her fellow soldiers confirmed this during the later retrial proceedings. Joan's actual role was as an inspirational leader and military strategist, not a frontline fighter. She rallied demoralized French troops, she planned siege tactics, and her presence on the battlefield gave soldiers the belief that God was on their side. She was wounded multiple times, including taking an arrow to the shoulder, but she led through courage and conviction, not through a body count. The real story is arguably more impressive than the Hollywood version, but a teenage girl holding a flag is harder to put on a movie poster than a teenage girl swinging a sword. 22. Western movies have trained us to believe that cowboys could gallop at full speed, whip out a revolver, and drill a target from 50 yards away without breaking a sweat. The reality of Wild West firearms was profoundly less impressive. The revolvers of the 1800s, like the Colt single-action army, were designed for close-range encounters. Their effective accuracy was roughly 15 yards, maybe 25 on a good day with a steady hand. Now add a galloping horse underneath you, bouncing you in every direction, plus the adrenaline of someone shooting back, and your chances of hitting anything specific drop to nearly zero. Ammunition was also expensive, so most cowboys rarely practiced shooting. The legendary gunslinger, who could fan a revolver and hit 6 targets in 2 seconds, is a pure Hollywood invention. Real frontier shootouts, on the rare occasions they happened, were messy, close-range, and terrifyingly inaccurate affairs where both parties were more likely to hit a bystander than each other. 23. The Curse of the Pharaohs is one of history's most famous supernatural stories. Open a mummy's tomb, and a mysterious ancient curse will strike you dead. It is dramatic, it is spooky, and it was essentially invented by newspaper reporters in the 1920s. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, It was a global media sensation. One newspaper, reportedly the Daily Mail, secured an exclusive deal for coverage, which meant every other journalist in the world was locked out and desperate for a story. So when Lord Carnarvon, who had funded the expedition, died a few months later from an infected mosquito bite, rival newspapers seized on it and started spinning tales of a deadly ancient curse. They invented inscriptions that did not exist, exaggerated connections between the tomb and random deaths, and created one of the most enduring myths of the 20th century. Howard Carter himself, the man who actually opened the tomb and handled the artifacts, lived for another 16 years and died at age 64. Some curse. 24. Medieval battle scenes in movies always look the same. Two massive armies charge at each other across an open field, crash together in a chaotic mess, and then it is just individual sword fights in every direction with no organization whatsoever. Real medieval warfare could not have been more different. Armies fought in disciplined formations. Infantry held shield walls or pike lines. Cavalry charged at specific flanks at calculated moments. Commanders positioned themselves where they could observe and send orders. Battles unfolded more like a deadly chess match than a bar fight, with feints, flanking maneuvers, and strategic retreats being common. The fighting itself was also much slower and more grinding than movies show, with armored men pushing against each other in organized blocks, trying to break the enemy's formation rather than having dramatic one-on-one duels. Individual combat was a last resort, not the opening move, but a movie showing two formations slowly grinding against each other for 4 hours while a commander sends messengers back and forth is not exactly blockbuster material. So Hollywood gave us the heroic free-for-all instead. 25. Disney's Pocahontas is a beautiful animated film about a young Native American woman who falls in love with the dashing English explorer John Smith, and together they bridge two worlds through the power of romance. Almost none of it happened. When John Smith arrived in the Chesapeake Bay area in 1607, Pocahontas, whose real name was Amanute and who was also known as Matawaka, was approximately 10 or 11 years old. Smith was 27. There was no romance. The famous story where Pocahontas throws herself over Smith's body to save him from execution? Smith did not even mention this incident until 1616, nearly a decade after it supposedly happened, and conveniently only after Pocahontas had become famous in England. Many historians believe he either fabricated or heavily embellished the story. Pocahontas was later kidnapped by English colonists, converted to Christianity, married a different Englishman named John Rolfe, traveled to England, and died there at approximately age 21. Her real life was far more complex and far more tragic than any Disney movie could capture. 26. If you have ever seen a movie set in ancient Rome, you have seen actors strutting around in gleaming white togas every single day, whether they are going to the Senate, shopping at the market, or just hanging out at home. The toga was actually the ancient Roman equivalent of a tuxedo. It was formal wear, reserved almost exclusively for political events, religious ceremonies, and official public occasions, and only male Roman citizens were even allowed to wear one. The garment was heavy, required elaborate draping that often needed a servant's help, and restricted movement so badly that doing any real physical activity in one was nearly impossible. For everyday life, Romans wore tunics, which were simple, comfortable, knee-length garments that allowed actual freedom of movement. Slaves, freedmen, women, children, basically everyone wore some version of a tunic for daily life. The idea that Romans were constantly swanning around in togas is like showing modern politicians wearing three-piece suits to bed, to the gym, and to the beach. 27. Hollywood has a very specific look for medieval peasants. Brown, gray, torn, muddy. Basically, a walking pile of sad rags that suggests color had not been invented yet. The reality was far more vibrant. Medieval peasants had access to a wide variety of cheap, natural plant-based dyes. Woad produced deep blues. Weld gave bright yellows. Madder created rich reds. Mixing these produced greens and oranges. Dyeing clothes was common practice across all social classes, and surviving textile fragments and illustrations from the period confirm that ordinary people wore surprisingly colorful clothing. The dull, monochrome look that Hollywood gives to the lower classes is essentially a visual shorthand that screams, "These people are poor and miserable," without any historical basis. Upper-class characters get the vibrant reds and purples, peasants get the mud filter. It is a deliberate filmmaking choice, not a reflection of reality. Medieval villages would have looked far more like a farmer's market than the gray, apocalyptic wasteland that movies love to show. 28. The 2014 film The Imitation Game tells the story of Alan Turing and the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, cracking the Nazi Enigma code during World War II. It is a gripping film, and Turing was genuinely one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. But the movie conveniently erases the people who actually broke Enigma first, the Polish mathematicians. In 1932, 7 years before the war even started, a Polish mathematician named Marian Rejewski, working at the Polish Cipher Bureau, reconstructed the German Enigma machine without ever having seen one. He and his colleagues Jerzy Rosiecki and Henryk Zagalski spent the next several years developing techniques and even building machines to decrypt Enigma messages. In July 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland, the Poles handed everything over to the British and French, all their mathematical work, their methods, and their decryption machines. Gordon Welchman, head of Bletchley Park's Hut 6, later wrote that their work would never have gotten off the ground without what the Poles provided. The Imitation Game reduced this critical contribution to essentially nothing. 29. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is often presented as one of history's greatest tragedies, a single catastrophic fire that wiped out the sum of ancient knowledge in one night, setting humanity back by centuries. It makes for an incredible movie scene, and it is almost entirely a myth. There was no single devastating fire that erased everything. The library's decline was a slow, grinding process that played out over centuries. Funding was cut by successive rulers who had other priorities. Scholars left for institutions that actually paid them. The collection deteriorated as scrolls were not replaced or maintained. Political upheavals, including multiple conflicts in Alexandria over hundreds of years, chipped away at the institution gradually. By the time the famous events that people cite as the fire occurred, the library was likely already a shadow of its former self. The real killer of the Library of Alexandria was not a dramatic blaze. It was budget cuts, bureaucratic neglect, and the slow erosion of institutional support, which, honestly, should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone paying attention today. 30. Indiana Jones spent an entire movie searching for the Holy Grail, which the film depicted as a humble but unmistakably cup-shaped vessel, the cup that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper. That image, a chalice or goblet, is now permanently lodged in popular culture as what the Grail looks like. But in the very first literary appearance of the Grail, written by the French poet Chrétien de Troyes in the late 12th century, the Grail was not a cup at all. It was described as a graal, which in medieval French referred to a wide, deep serving dish or platter, basically an elegant plate used to serve food. Later writers, particularly Robert de Boron in the early 13th century, transformed the dish into the cup of the Last Supper and connected it to the blood of Christ, which is the version that eventually reached Hollywood. So the object that has launched 1,000 treasure hunts, conspiracy theories, and Nicolas Cage movies started its literary life as fancy dinnerware. Somewhere, Indiana Jones is very confused. Sauce. 31. There is a popular story that Marco Polo brought pasta to Italy from China after his famous travels in the late 13th century, introducing Italians to noodles and changing European cuisine forever. It is a charming origin story, and it is wrong. Italians were eating pasta long before Marco Polo was even born. Evidence of pasta-like food in Italy goes back to at least the 4th century before the Common Era, with Etruscan tomb carvings depicting what appears to be pasta-making equipment. The ancient Romans had their own versions of dough-based dishes, and Arab traders brought dried pasta varieties to Sicily around the 9th century. By the time Polo returned from China in the 1290s, Italians had been perfecting pasta for over 1,000 years. The myth seems to have originated from a misreading of Polo's travel accounts, where he described a Chinese starch product and a translator helpfully compared it to pasta. That comparison snowballed into Polo discovered pasta, and somehow an entire civilization's culinary history got credited to one traveler who showed up very, very late to the party. 32. In movies, the Great Wall of China is always the same. One continuous, perfectly constructed stone megastructure stretching endlessly across mountains. A single unbroken barrier visible from space. The reality is a lot less cinematic. The Great Wall is not one wall. It is a chaotic, sprawling network of multiple walls, trenches, watchtowers, and even simple earthen mounds, built by different Chinese dynasties over a period of roughly 2,000 years. The earliest sections date back to the 7th century before the Common Era, and the iconic stone portions that tourists visit today were mostly built during the Ming Dynasty, which started in the 14th century. Between these sections? Gaps. Lots of gaps. Some stretches were made of packed dirt that has largely eroded away. Others were little more than ditches. The total combined length of all wall sections, including branches and secondary structures, stretches over 13,000 miles, but calling it one wall is like calling every fence in Texas one fence. It is a collection of border defenses built over millennia, not a single ancient megaproject. 33. The term Dark Ages has been used for centuries to describe the period after the fall of Rome as a time when civilization basically shut down. No science, no progress, no learning, just 1,000 years of people sitting in filth, waiting for the Renaissance to show up and save them. Hollywood absolutely loves this version, showing medieval Europe as an intellectual wasteland. But the so-called Dark Ages produced an astonishing number of innovations. Eyeglasses were invented in Italy around the late 1200s, literally changing how millions of people could see the world. Mechanical clocks appeared in the 13th century, revolutionizing how societies organized time. The heavy plow transformed Northern European agriculture and enabled the feeding of growing populations. And the first universities in the world, including Bologna, Oxford, and Paris, were all founded during this supposedly brain-dead era. The period also saw advances in architecture, navigation, and legal systems. The darkness in Dark Ages originally referred to a lack of written records from the period, not a lack of intelligence. But that nuance got lost somewhere between the history books and the Hollywood scripts. That is 33 chunks of history that came straight from a screenplay, and this is barely scratching the surface. So tell me this. Pick one movie that you think did the most damage to how people understand real history. Name it in the comments and explain why. I want a full war in the comment section over this. Like the video if your brain just got rewired, and subscribe because we are just getting started.